For tonight, okay. Yeah.
If a Christian who seems generally interested in Torah, Judaism, and what the Jews do, and ourselves, asks us if they're currently keeping the Shevet Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, what should we tell them?
I'm sorry. If they ask you, are they keeping the Shevet?
Yeah. Am I doing things right?
Yeah. So the truth of the matter is, the issue of can a Christian be a righteous Noahide? Right? Non-Jews have to keep the 7 commandments of Noach. They don't have to be Jewish, and we don't try to even encourage conversion, but they do have to keep the 7 mitzvahs of Noach. And one of those mitzvos is not to worship idolatry, not to worship avodah zarah, and to believe in one God. So the obvious question is, can a goy be a righteous Gentile if they are a professing Christian? So this is a huge machlokas. It is the shita of the Rambam that Christianity, of course this is pre-Reformation, so he was talking about probably not even Catholicism, he's probably talking about Coptic church in Egypt and the like, but it is the shita of the Rambam that those who believe in Jesus, those who believe in Yeshu HaNotzri are Ovdei Avodah Zarah, they are idolaters, number one, because they have a trinity, of the notion of dividing God into multiple parts, and number two, because they assign a physical body to the divinity, which is also a form of Avodah Zarah. The Rambam, on the other hand, did maintain that Islam is not Avodah Zarah. It's a monotheistic religion. He actually hated Islam. He hated Muslims because he said they oppressed Jews more than anyone else ever did, and he called Muhammad a Meshuggah. But at least in terms of Avodah Zarah, he gave Islam a pass on that it's not Avodah Zarah. And al pi halacha, that is why it is mutter for a Jew to go into a mosque. Mora Samachpela in Hebron a mosque is built over Mora Samachpela. And when you go to daven at the kever of Avraham Avinu or whatever, you are davening in a mosque, and that is permitted. You wouldn't be allowed to go into a church because that's a makom of Avodah Zarah. It's a whole machlokas. What if it is no longer used as a church? It's only a museum. That's a question. But certainly you cannot go into an active church. So according to the Rambam, it's very, very clear that a Christian is not keeping the 7 mitzvahs of Noach. On the other hand, we have the shita of Rabbeinu Tam, Rashi's grandson, who lived in Catholic France. And he made a very interesting distinction. He said that a profession of Christianity would be idolatry for a Jew. A Jew's definition of how to serve God would render Christianity pagan. But it is not a violation of the Noahide law, meaning not that it's true. It's not that, it's true for a goy and not for a Jew. I mean, it's either false or true. But a goy who professes Christianity can still be considered a monotheist and in compliance with the 7 commandments of Noach. This is also the view of the Meiri, one of the Rishonim. So as a result, you can tell the non-Jewish friends that there are views that would consider this to be a fulfillment of the Noahide law. There are other views that argue, and therefore speak to your Noahide rabbi about which way to go. So this is a huge machlokas that has many, many ramifications. For example, according to the halacha, Israel doesn't follow this halacha, but there is a halacha that a non-Jew who has not accepted the Noahide laws is not allowed to live in Eretz Yisrael. So if you took the position like the Rambam, that Christianity is Oved Avodah Zarah, then Christians would not be allowed to live in the land of Israel. Obviously, if we permit Christians living here, we're following the shita of Rabbeinu Tam. Now, I do have to say that there is a machlokes achronim if that is Rabbeinu Tam shita, meaning the normal way Rabbeinu Tam is presented is Christianity is not Avodah Zarah for a non-Jew, right? That's how Rabbeinu Tam is normally paraphrased. In fact, the native Yehudah has a whole other interpretation of Rabbeinu Tam, in which Rabbeinu Tam was also Modeh, it's Avodah Zarah, but a Jew does not have a prohibition of causing a Christian to swear by Yashka. And he goes through the idea of what is a Jew's responsibility not to cause an oath to idolatry. So, according to native Yehudah, you'd have no hope, meaning the Christian is indeed an Oved Avodah Zarah. But as I say, most understand Rabbeinu Tam the conventional way. Yeah.
Here's ascendant. Why did Hashem make Yaakov and Esav twins as opposed to separate births, like the other sibling rivalries in the Torah? Is there a connection between these twins and the other twins in Bereshis, Peretz, and Zerach? We often speak about the teshuvah of Yishmael. Will Esav do teshuvah in the future?
I'm sorry, read the last thing again?
We often speak about the teshuvah of Yishmael.
Yeah.
Will Esav do teshuvah in the future?
Yeah. The notion of why Yaakov and Esav have to be twins, why couldn't they be separate births? Yishmael and Yitzchak were separated by 14 years. There is some makoros that actually say that Hashem's original plan was that there would be one person. There wouldn't be twins. There would be a Yaakov who is struggling with the Yetzer Haras of Esav, and Yaakov would reach a certain madrega precisely by the intensity of the struggle. And it was only when Rivka, so Rivka is at fault here in a sense, when Rivka complained and she said, I don't want to live, so they got split, so the righteousness became Yaakov and the evil became Esav. So the twin was kind of an outgrowth of almost a mistake in which there would have been originally one. But even if we assume, like Kipshuta, Shel Mikra, that they were twins, I think there's still an idea here that highlighting the point that Esav had a potential for kedushah. I think I mentioned before, either here or somewhere else, that Esav too had a potential to have a share in the formative role of the Jewish people. That is why Yitzchak wanted to give Esav a bracha. And the notion would be that Esav would manage Eretz Yisrael and the Gashmias and the material part of society and utilize his resources for Yaakov. And this would have created the Yisachar Zevulun partnership in which Esav could have been a co-equal partner with Yaakov. And twinning is kind of bringing out the notion of co-equal partnership in a very, very strong and vivid way. Now that makes the tragedy of Esav a much, much greater tragedy, that it's not just Esav is a bad guy, but it's a tragedy that Esav had the potential of greatness. Within the limits and the parameters of his personality, he could have done great things. He and Yaakov could have been a team. Esav would have managed Eretz Yisrael. He would have created the political society. He would have, built the dams and the bridges and everything else. And Yaakov would sit and learn and teach Torah. And it would have been the Yisachar Zevulun partnership. And that's exactly what Yitzchak envisioned. Rivka understood that it was too late to do that. Perhaps that could have started when they were young children, but at this age it wasn't shaykh anymore. So because of this, the last question you asked, or the person asked was, will Esav ever do tshuva? The truth is there actually are some chazals that say Esav too will do tshuva. Not all of Esav. Part of Esav will be destroyed. But that's true for Yishmael as well. We've already seen that. But there will be an Esav coming back to Klal Yisrael as well. That Esav too will do tshuva. And Chazal say the following. Chazal say that Esav is described as a chazir, a pig. And there are two reasons. Why is a pig the worst, right? A pig is the most repulsive of all treif animals, right? Even people who don't keep kosher might say something like, I don't eat chazer. What's so bad about a pig? Besides, dirty, whatever it is, what's so bad? So it says because a pig represents hypocrisy, because there are two sides for a kosher land animal. One is split hoofs, and the other is chewing the cud. A chazer, a pig, has split hoofs. It actually is split hoofs, but it doesn't chew its cud. So a pig represents something that on the outside looks kosher, and on the inside is treif. That's worse. At least a horse is honest. A horse says, I'm treif. A horse doesn't try to fool you. A horse has no pretensions. But the chazer shows you its split hoofs, and that's part of the evil of Esav, is the hypocrisy that's involved. But the word chazir is also connected to lachzor, to come back. And it says, liyasid lavo, the chazir is going to become kosher. Now, what that means about the pig is very interesting, that seems to indicate that somehow we will discover a pig that actually is kosher. And indeed, some people say we've done that already. There is a pig called the babarusa, which has split hoofs and chews its cud. So it is a kosher pig. And some say that that is a fulfillment of the pre-messianic prophecy, that the chazir will return and be kosher. And that also is a remez that Esav, that is called the chazir, Esav, will also come back and be kosher. After all, when you are raised by Yitzchak and Rivka, you must have something good in you, right? It's not shaykh to say you were raised by Yitzchak and Rivka and you're irredeemable. Something did rub off, and that little thing that rubbed off will eventually come to fruition when Mashiach comes.
And the connection to Peretz and Zerach?
Yeah, so Peretz and Zerach are also twins. That's from Yehudah and Tamar. And you'll remember that Peretz is the ancestor of Boaz, who is the ancestor of David. So all of the Malchus, Beis David, and Mashiach comes from Peretz. That's why in the Chadodi it says, Al Yad Ish Ben Partzi. Mashiach is called Ben Partzi, the son of, or the descendant of Peretz. Zerach had Chashivas, but the Malchus goes through Peretz. So the notion of the twins also indicates that one becomes the melech and one becomes tafel to the melech. Secondary, auxiliary. That's exactly what the original plan was with Yaakov and Esav, that Yaakov would have the primary spiritual legacy, and Esav would be auxiliary to Yaakov. So yes, there is a match there that one has the malchus, which is the leadership, but in Yaakov's case, it's the spiritual leadership, and one is the one that is the facilitator and the helper in that role. Yeah.
So I asked the Rav a question last week on why doesn't the Chumash state explicitly when Rivka died, and then one of the teretz is it's because she didn't have the proper kavod in burial. Also, we know that Leah, who doesn't really mention Leah passing away, so kind of a couple of the big matriarchs doesn't really talk about their death too much. And so, kind of two parts. The first question is, why doesn't the Chumash really go over how the matriarchs like Rivka and Rachel really passed away? And then the second part would be, if it's because Rivka didn't have the proper burial, then what did she do to not deserve that proper cover?
Yeah, so the issue is that the Torah kind of leaves out a lot of detail regarding the imahos, particularly the burial. The Torah describes the death of Sarah and her burial, and the Torah describes the death of Rachel in childbirth and her burial in Kever Rachel in Beis Lechem. But we're not told about Rivka, we're not told about Leah, we're not told about Bilhah and Zilpah for sure. We're told very, very little about them generally. So I guess this is part of a larger question, meaning, the question is assuming that logically we should have been given this information, and you have to come up with the reason why we're not given the information, right? That's the basis of the question. But maybe the assumption might be the opposite, meaning the Torah does not record every historical detail. I mean, there are many for example, we're not told about the death of Noah, really. Right? I mean, they're great people. We know nothing about really how they died or whatever it is. And apparently the notion is the Torah records historical facts only if there are spiritual lessons to be learned from them. And that's why when you have these long lists of Yishmael's lineage and Esav's lineage, we do have real questions. Why is this being recorded? And we have to have mystical explanations sometimes. So it could be, I'm just saying this al pi pshat, that as great as Leah was, she died. I mean, meaning to say, there was not that there was anything bad that you have to cover up, but there was no particular experience or lesson to be pointed out in indicating her death. So the Torah didn't record it, meaning the Torah is not a history book. The Torah, the word Torah comes from lahoros, to show, to teach. Torah is about teaching. So anything that is not a teachable experience, so to speak, the Torah will not record. So that might be an answer to a lot of questions, that, yeah, this isn't recorded because there was nothing particular that we would learn from it. And I have to say, too, without trying to be anti-women, I'm absolutely not anti-women. See, as I say, some of my best friend happens to be a woman, which is true hopefully for every husband. But the truth is, it's pretty rare. I mean, you can count on one hand, really, the number of deaths of women that are recorded. And look at Tanakh, right? It normally doesn't talk about women dying, right? Maybe it wasn't Tznius or whatever it would be. So instead of asking why doesn't it record certain deaths, you have to ask the other way around. The few deaths of women that it does record, why does it record it? Because the norm is not to record it, you see? Yeah.
I was wondering, right now, like, we hear with the term, like, modern Orthodox, like, oftentimes it just means, like, I keep Shabbos, I keep kosher, but then, like, anything else is kind of, like, inconvenient. We don't, even though, like, it isn't to say that there aren't big, frum people in modern Orthodox, many of them do that. And, like, the main founder of that was Rabbi Soloveitchik, came from Brisk, and comes from this big family of halacha, and, like, very conservative, like, family. How did he kind of get onto this path, and how did he not really foresee what would happen with, like, the assimilation rate?
Yeah. So you have to understand that, first of all, there's a whole bunch of terms here that get mixed up and conflated and combined. There is modern Orthodox, and there is centrist Orthodox, and there is open Orthodox. And I think open Orthodox renamed itself to be modern Orthodox, which forced modern Orthodox to relabel itself as Central Orthodox. So when you see the word modern Orthodox, you have to be mavarer. Are we talking about what used to be called open Orthodox that called itself modern Orthodox? Or are we talking about what is now called centrist Orthodox, which used to be called modern Orthodox? Now, so that's one thing. I mean, in truth, it's quite confusing that the words mean different things. But the second thing that's important, and this is really the basis of your question, is you have to differentiate between what is called modern Orthodoxy as a philosophical system and modern Orthodoxy as a behavioral system on the ground. Modern Orthodoxy, or centrist, whatever you want to call it, the name is not really important for our purposes, as a philosophical system, is very much connected to Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, although he didn't use the word modern Orthodoxy, that there is a value to secular wisdom, and a general culture can give you insight in avodas Hashem. And in that philosophical system, there was no question that Torah and mitzvahs were the absolute foundation of your life. They were the most important thing. There was no inyan to be makel or lenient in everything. But you believed that there was a certain usefulness and utility in secular wisdom and knowledge in your avodas Hashem. That is modern Orthodoxy as a philosophical system. And yes, Rav Hirsch and Rav Soloveitchik were not the same. I'm not saying they are the same, otherwise I'm going to get hate mail from YU about this. Of course there are differences, but this was Rav Hirsch on some level, this was Rav Soloveitchik certainly, his son-in-law Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, who had a PhD in literature from Harvard, but he was a baki in Shas and Poskim, and a very, very devoted Rosh Yeshiva, and truly a Bal Musar, a person of outstanding, amazing midos tovos. But he believed in the notion that modernity had something to contribute to my avodas Hashem. So that's one sheet. And then you have, let's say, people like the Chazon Ish who said, we don't need that outside stuff. It just distorts the Torah. So that's a legitimate machlokas of shita within Klal Yisrael. Now, what happened is, though, that modern Orthodoxy sometimes degenerates, not always. You have Rav Soloveitchik, you have Rav Lichtenstein, you have many of the Rosh Yeshivas at YU who are big Talmidei Chachamim, and they're modern Orthodox in the sense that I defined it. But then there's another type of modern Orthodoxy in which, you really want to live a comfortable life. You want to live a life without too many impediments. So you're makel in halacha, you might be makel in mixed swimming or negiah or various other things. But it's unfortunate that the same label of modern Orthodoxy is given to that as it was given to Rav Soloveitchik, when in fact they're two very, very different types of phenomena. One is the modern orthodoxy of commitment to Torah with the belief that Chochmos can help you in Avodas Hashem. The other is the notion, hey, maybe Torah and mitzvahs are not that important, and I'll do it when it's not so hard, and I won't do it when it is a little hard, right? So they're two different things, and maybe it's unfair to kind of blame Rav Soloveitchik for that type of modern orthodoxy when he himself, denounced it quite a lot. Now, again, I also have to say that I don't mean to imply that any Jew that is modern Orthodox is mezalzel in halacha. That absolutely is not the case. There are many, many fine frum Jews who are modern Orthodox. But there is no question, again, just to be honest, just as a reporter, without expressing any judgment, that there is a lot of modern Orthodoxy, a lot, not all, but a lot of modern Orthodoxy that does not take halacha seriously. Meaning they'll go with it when it's convenient, and if it's inconvenient, they'll do something else. And yeah, that's unfortunately a lack of Yiras Shamayim. It's a lack of commitment. Sometimes people get enamored with secular value systems like woke culture and gay and lesbian rights and other things, abortion rights, and that kind of overrides their commitment to halacha. So there is a problem. Now, one could think about this. Well, okay, is someone like Rav Soloveitchik responsible? Meaning, how did you get from his version of modern orthodoxy to the version of modern orthodoxy that is less halachically compliant? We could debate that. We could discuss that. Is it the problem that once you open yourself up to secularism, it's going to poison you? Meaning, maybe Rav Soloveitchik was too optimistic that secular culture can be used in a positive way, and maybe the best idea is keep it out? Is that it? It's interesting. When Rav Soloveitchik died, and he was one of the Gedolei Hador. I mean, not only did he come from Gedolim, but he himself was a Gadol, but he wasn't recognized as such in the yeshiva world, but he truly was a Gadol. So the Jewish Observer had a dilemma. Jewish Observer was the Aguda magazine. And on one hand, they whenever a Gadol died, like when my Rosh Hashiva died, Rav Ruderman, they wrote beautiful, long articles, Rav Moshe Feinstein, Rav Kamenetsky. These were classic articles. The Jewish Observer, Hespedim on Gedolim were beautiful, beautiful works of art. I still, I used to get the Jewish Observer before it went bankrupt, and those issues I keep. So when Rav Soloveitchik died, there's a very big problem. If a stam modern Orthodox rabbi died, they just ignored it. They didn't feel they had to report on it at all. But Rav Soloveitchik, we can't ignore him, but we don't want to, do a Yaakov Kamenetsky article on him. So what do we do? So they did something that to this day, there are Talmidim of YU that have never forgiven the Jewish Observer. They wrote like a half a page thing, and they had a line that's truly a genius. This is a genius line. They said, he walked a path that was so unique that he was the only one who can do it. Meaning, he tried to incorporate secular wisdom and Torah, and okay, he did it. But in his uniqueness and greatness, it was a path that can only be trodden by one person, as if to say, he did it, but it's a poisonous madrega for other people. Brilliant kind of, what's the expression? Damning by faint praise. They're praising him, but they're also saying, don't follow his derech. So the point, again, this is a long-winded answer. The point that you're making is a very good point, but it's a little complicated because Rav Soloveitchik's version was not what it degenerated into. Very, very far. Yeah.
How come Hanukkah doesn't have its own Masechta in Shas?
How come?
Hanukkah doesn't have its own.
Yeah. So Hanukkah, right? Hanukkah is not treated so much in Shas. First of all, the Mishnah mentioned, now remember, the Hanukkah story, as I mentioned, was around 185 BCE. The Mishnah was written approximately 200 CE. So that means the Mishnah was written approximately 385 years after the Hanukkah story. So when the Mishnah was written, the Hanukkah holiday was very well known. The Mishnah itself mentions Hanukkah very infrequently, and often in very crazy contexts. It talks about the idea that if I have a camel, bava kama, that has a big bundle of straw going across its back, and it's in a Rishus Harabim, and it gets ignited by your fire, right? You have a fire in Rishus Harabim, and the straw gets ignited, and a house is on fire. So who's responsible for destroying the house? The owner of the camel, or the one who put his fire in Rishus Harabim? So the Mishnah says the one who put the fire is responsible, because you're not supposed to put your fire in Rishus Harabim. But it says, but if it was a Hanukkah there, you're not responsible because that's where you light your Hanukkah. So Hanukkah is mentioned as a very little aside. So the Mishnah Kemat doesn't mention Hanukkah at all. And the Gemara in Shabbos, which discusses Hanukkah, the laws of Hanukkah, is around 3 or 3.5 blot. Now Purim, it's a whole Maseches of Mishnayos, right? So why is Hanukkah treated so minimally in the Gemara? In the Mishnah, almost not at all, and in the Gemara, less than 4 blot. So the Chassam Sofer gives a reason that's kind of a very unusual reason. He says, the Chashmonaim established a monarchy. They established a dynasty. And the Ramban says that was sinful because after they won the war, they should have turned over the Malchus to a descendant of David HaMelech, Shevet Yehudah. And it was an Aveira for the Chashmonaim to become Melech. Now, Rav Yehudah HaNasi was a descendant of Hillel, who was a descendant of David HaMelech. And therefore, Rav Yehudah HaNasi resented that the Chashmonaim took Malchus away from his ancestors. Therefore, he kind of boycotted them in the Mishnah. Now, that's a very, very schwer reason. I mean, Rav Yehudah HaNasi is like bearing a grudge, and I don't like these guys. They took a job away from my grandfather. Therefore, I'm not going to mention them. But the Chassam Sofer probably doesn't mean that exactly. But he means that since it was a sin for them to have a Malchus, Rav Yehudah HaNasi didn't want to glorify the Chashmonaim. That's reason one. He didn't want to glorify Malchus Chashmonai because they shouldn't have taken the Malchus. Reason number two is more of a political reason, that when the Mishnah was written, it was not politically correct to publicize Hanukkah a lot, because what are you celebrating? You're celebrating the overthrow of foreign domination of an occupying country in Eretz Yisrael. Well, what were the Romans doing, right? So Hanukkah was downplayed in that way. And the third reason was that Malchus Chashmonai themselves became Hellenists. In other words, they were fighting Hellenism, and eventually they became the very thing they were fighting. So the Chachamim didn't want to glorify the Malchus of Chashmonai that much. So those are different reasons why Hanukkah was not emphasized as much. I think, though, some Sfarim say that there was, in Masechtas Ketanos, these are later Masechtas, a Maseches Hanukkah that we've lost. I don't know what the proof of that is, but they claim there may have been a Maseches Hanukkah that we no longer have. Yeah.
I was wondering with Moshe Rabbeinu, he had, and we know he was married to, I think her name was Sephora, but did he have any other wives? What do we know of his children?
Moshe Rabbeinu had a whole career before he took the Jews out of Mitzrayim. Think about this. Moshe Rabbeinu took the Jews out of Mitzrayim when he was 80 years old. He left Mitzrayim after he killed the Egyptian. He had to flee to Midian and other places. He was 20 years old, meaning there were 60 years from the time he left to the time he came back. At one point he married Tzipora, but the Medrash doesn't tell us what he did with all of those years. So there actually is, the Chumash doesn't say, there actually are Midrashim that give him a whole career. He went to Cush, he went to Africa, Ethiopia. He was king of Ethiopia for a long time. In fact, some say, if you remember in the Chumash, the Lashon Hara that Miriam says about Moshe, he took a Cushite woman. Now Rashi says that means Sipora, And why is Sipporah called Cushi? Well, Cushi normally means like a black African, because her deeds were so unique that as conspicuous as black skin would be, as Sipporah's righteousness routines, it's a very indirect way to refer to Sipporah. But some say, no, this is referring to another wife. Another wife Moshe had earlier in his life, who was a Cushite woman, a woman from Africa, presumably a black woman, and he was king. Did he have children from this other wife? I'm going to check. I don't believe he did, but I want to check it to be sure. And Moshe had a whole career, which is, it's a very interesting thing. When you're 80 years old, you normally think about retiring, right? You think, okay, I've done my life, now it's time to retire. But you see, from Moshe Rabbeinu, you never know. Maybe the whole tachlis of your life is going to be towards the end. I mean, he was king here and a ruler here. He actually spent 10 years in prison. He was imprisoned at various times. He had a whole life, which the Torah does not tell us about. By the way, that also goes back to my earlier point. The Torah doesn't tell us about that part of Moshe Rabbeinu's life because there was no particular musar for us in that life. But he did have, according to this, he did have another wife, and he may have had children, although I believe he did not. Yeah.
There are a number of tragedies that we brought upon ourselves contemporaneous with or after Matan Torah. The Tanakh and outside Tanakh make a huge deal out of it, attach a lot of importance to it, emphasis. Meraglim, Kete Egel, the two Beit Mikdash, like a number of things like that that really had a very bad impact on the Jewish people. So I'm always wondering why there's nothing much said, not much emphasis, not including Tisha B'Av or anything. And I'm thinking about the separation of the 12 tribes with the Yehudah and the Yemen and the others. That led to many, many terrible things, civil war and the loss of Israel and so much more. How come there isn't much about that?
So you're asking why, among all the tragedies that we do discuss the Egel, we do discuss the Meraglim, but we don't particularly discuss the splitting up of the Jewish people into two kingdoms, in which 10 tribes went with a king of the north from the tribe of Ephraim, called Malchus Yisrael, and 2 tribes, Yehudah and Binyamin, remained with the south, the Beis Mikdash and Yerushalayim. Thank you. And that apparently is a huge tragedy of division among Bnei Yisrael, and the question is why we don't talk about that so much. It's an interesting question. I'm not sure I know. I will tell you this, that on Tisha B'Av, the only kina that is repeated twice, Tisha B'Av night and Tisha B'Av day, is a kina called Shomron Titein Kola. It's a very short kina, and it was written by Rav Shlomo Ibn Gabaral, who is the author of Adon Olam. He was a great philosopher and poet. And that kina is about the division of the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes. So it's interesting that although we don't talk about it a lot, it is the conclusion of both the evening service and the morning service, as if to say it's something we have to be aware of a lot. And if you read Tanakh, you actually see that the Nevi'im talk about it a lot. The famous posek, it's been set to a Karlbach Nigan, Uvo ha'ovdim me'eretz Ashur, that those who have been destroyed will be brought back from the land of Assyria. V'hanidochem me'eretz Mitzrayim, and those who were pushed into Egypt will be brought back. That's referring to the restoration of the 10 tribes, the reunification of the Jewish people. That you're right, there is something that we lost when the kingdoms got split. And as you know, the 10 tribes were lost, meaning to say they were exiled more than 100 years before the Churban, and they never were fully reunited with the Jewish people. So in a sense, we're living, less than half of the nation. So it is a great tragedy, but I think Tisha B'Av focuses very much on the origin tragedies, the origin of everything, the Egel, the Meraglim, and this is a consequence, and the Chorban Beis HaMikdash was a consequence. Yeah.
Here's another send-in. What do we know of Kilav ben David HaMelech? He was one of the 4 people that Chazal say never sinned, but it seems like Tanakh has very little to say about him. Also, in general of the 4 who never sinned, what can we learn from them and the way they live their lives? What does it mean to truly never sin?
Yeah, so it's interesting. David HaMelech actually had many wives, not 1,000. His son had more wives than him, but David had 18 wives and concubines. And David had many sons, many sons. Shlomo was not the only son that David had. David had sons who rebelled against him. But David, one of David's sons, his name was Kilav. Kilav, not Kalev, Kilav, Chaf Lamed Aleph Beis. And Kilav was not interested in political intrigue. He was not interested in kingship. He was not interested in monarchy. He was not interested in politics. Kilav simply wanted to learn Torah. And we are told, according to Chazal, that Kilav was a phenomenally great Talmid Chacham. And even the word Kilav is said to mean he put his father to shame. Not consciously, of course, but he was absolutely so great that even David HaMelech, who was great in Torah, was kind of in shame compared to the greatness of his son. And I think the fact that the Nach says so little about Kilav is really designed to communicate the idea that he was so humble and modest and reticent that, if you would be living in his time, you would know nothing about him. He was never in the newspapers, right? Whatever it would be. He lived an anonymous life that was totally devoted to Avodas Hashem. So in Nach, it's important that you learn not only from what is stated, but you learn from what not is stated. The fact that nothing is said about him indicates his tznius, his humility, his modesty, his greatness. And indeed, that's why there's another Chazal that say that Kilav ben David was one of the people who had no Averis. He entered Olam Haba, even as a physical body. He had no Averis. And that came because of his purity and his lack of involvement in Olam Hazeh. Now, you ask, what does it mean to be without sin? Well, I wouldn't know. I think none of us really know, because none of us have ever been in that situation. It is interesting when you look at the list of people without sin, it's often not the famous ones. So David had sins, but Yishai didn't have sins. Moshe had sins, Moshe Rabbeinu, but Amram, according to one opinion, didn't have sins. It's almost like the father, the progenitor. Or in the case of Binyamin, Yaakov had Averos, but Binyamin didn't have Averos, according to one opinion. And David had Averos, and Kilav, right? So David is interesting. David's father was without Chet, and Kilav ben David, according to one opinion, was also without Chet. But it shows you, I think, the union of modesty and reticence as a component to greatness. This is a very interesting idea. It just reminds me of a Maisa with Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, just a Maisa. There was an old Yerushalmi Talmid Chacham. His name was Rav Nassan Kuperstuck. If you never heard of him, it's right, you never heard of him, because he was basically unknown. He was a person who spent his whole life just learning Torah. Yomam, B'layla, didn't become a Rosh Hashiva, didn't become a Rav. And he grew up with people like Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. These were his friends, Rav Elyashiv. These were his chaverim growing up. And they became, famous in the Torah world. And he largely did not become famous in the Torah world, although there were Yechidim who knew him, of course. He was not totally anonymous. And a Talmud once said that he once was with Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And they saw Rav Nassan Kuperstuck davening at the Kotel. And Rav Shlomo Zalman said, people wonder why the sun comes up every morning. The world is so corrupt that, why do we even deserve a world? And he said, That's why we deserve a world. People like Rav Nassan, who serve Hashem without kavod, without recognition, without anybody noticing them. And Rav Shlomo Zalman said he was jealous of it. He was jealous of the idea, on one level, that once you're a public person, you're involved in a lot of questions, and Rav Nassan didn't have to be involved in anything. But number two, and the Talmud Devar talks about it, we didn't get to this yet, that, kavod affects you. Kavod affects you, meaning to say, the madregas you could reach without the kavod are greater than the madregas you reach when you have kavod. So part of the greatness of Kilav was precisely because he was such a private person. Like nobody knew anything he was doing. They say with Rav Moshe too. When Rav Moshe was 9 years old, Rav Moshe's father was a Rav in Russia. This was pre-revolutionary Russia, right? Still under the Tsar. And Rav Moshe at 9, Rav Moshe was a brilliant kid. Rav Moshe at 9 already knew, I think, the three Bavas, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Basra. I don't know if he knew the Taisus, I don't know, maybe even that, but certainly Mora and Rashi. He knew the three Masechtas pretty good. So when Rav Moshe would walk in the street, a 9-year-old kid, Balabatim would stand up for him because people knew he was so special. His father was very upset. He says, "You're going to make my son a Balgaiva. He's going to lose everything that he was able to achieve." Can you imagine? He says, don't show him any type of special kavod, so that way he can learn the Torah with humility and anava. So, again, this is what I think of when I think of Kilav ben David was able to have that environment, and that created an extraordinary level of purity. Yeah.
When we wash Negelwasser in the morning, I've heard this idea that we should dry our hands after we wash. We should be very careful to make sure the water goes into the sink as to not be on the floor. My question is, when we dry our hands, let's say on a towel, and now that towel is wet, do we have to worry about touching that towel that now the waters are on? And if we're not worried about that, why does the buck stop there?
Yeah, the issue of washing hands in the morning, we say that when you go to sleep, the holy neshama, your godly neshama, leaves your body, and all you have is the animal neshama, and there is what is called a spirit of impurity in you, because that's just the animal life. It's not the godly life. When you wake up in the morning, though, and your godly soul returns, so the ruach hatuma leaves your whole body, but it remains concentrated in your hands. So your hands still have this ruach of tuma, this ruach that affects your connection to God. So Kabbalistically, when you wash three times, alternating, that takes away the ruach ra. Okay? So since effectively it gets transferred from your hands into the water, so we say that it may be spiritually dangerous, maybe even physically dangerous, for someone to walk over that water. So the reason why you don't pour it on the floor is there's a special hakpada that people shouldn't walk over it. Now, for some reason, I can't say I understand this because this is a mystical process. The hakpada is much stronger walking over it than touching it. So with the towel, the issue is simply touching it. It's not going to be so bad. Masha ein kain, walking over it, that's considered to be more dangerous. So that's why we're very makbid not to pour it on the floor. It should be in a kli that you can dispose. Now, this idea of ruach ra does have a lot of ramifications. So, for example, if you touch food before netilas yadayim, either the food shouldn't be eaten, or some say you can wash the food 3 times. Pour water over the apple 3 times. If you touch liquid before netilas yadayim, maybe you have to throw out the liquid because there's no eitzah to be masakein, the liquid. So on this, Rav Shlomo Zalman said an interesting thing. He said there was a Messiah, an old tradition among the Yerushalmis, that ruach ra is no longer a concern because of the Ger Tzedek of Vilna. What's the story here? It's a long story. I'll try to be very, very quick on it. In the time of the Vilna Gaon, there was a non-Jew who converted to Judaism. His non-Jewish name was Valentin Potocki. And his father was a Count Potocki, and his father was the richest landowner in Poland. Phenomenally wealthy person. He owned 999 estates. And people asked him the obvious question, well, why do you own 999 estates? Why don't you buy one more and you have 1,000? So he said, no. If I have 1,000 and people say he has 1,000, they're going to say, well, he's rounding it off. Really, it's 990 or 991. But if I have 999, they know it's exact. That way, I get full credit for all of my gashmias. His son Valentin became a ger at a time when it was a capital crime. You would be burnt at the stake as a heretic for being a ger. And he became a Talmud of the Vilna Gaon, and for a while he was living in hiding. People didn't know, but eventually the news got revealed. In fact, there's an old tradition that a Jew turned him in, and the Vilna Gaon cursed that family that they would suffer disabilities for the rest of existence, and kachave. And the Ger Tzedek was burnt at the stake. He was burnt at the stake the second day of Shavuos. And his ashes are buried. The Gra died later. His ashes are buried next to the Vilna Gaon, the Ger Tzedek of Vilna. And there was a Messiah among the Chachmei Yerushalayim that the zechus of his death al Kiddush Hashem was so powerful that it destroyed the Ruach Ra in the world. And even though we still have to keep the halacha of Netilas Yadayim, because we have to wash our hands, we can't just say, don't wash anymore, but we don't have to be so concerned with touching food and other things, because there's no longer a Ruach Ra, because the Ger Tzedek broke it. The Ger Tzedek smashed it. It's interesting that the Gra visited him in prison shortly before, I think right before Shavuos, the Gra visited him in prison, and the Gra said, I could release you by a nes. I could do Kabbalistic things, and you could be saved. So we asked the Gra, am I mechuyev to save my life by miraculous means? Meaning normally, pikuach nefesh. But do I have to use a miracle to get out? And the Gra said, no, you don't have to. The Torah is not mechayev you to do miracles. The Torah is mechayev you to do natural ways of saving your life, which wouldn't help you here. But if the only way you could save your life is with a nes, you're not mechuyev, but I'll do it for you. And he said, if I'm not mechuyev, I would rather die al Kiddush Hashem. If I don't have to stay alive, I would rather die. I want to die al Kiddush Hashem. And then he asked the Gra another shaila. He said, we know that every second of life is precious. On the other hand, when you go to a mitzvah, you should go as quickly as possible. So when I'm being led to be burnt at the stake, should I run because I'm doing the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem? Or should I walk as slowly as I can, because that way I will be preserving my life a few seconds or a few minutes longer? So here, this must be the very first time. The Vilna Gaon said, I don't know, I have to think about it. I can't imagine the Vilna Gaon said that too many times. But the Vilna Gaon said, I have to think about it. And they say, as he was being led to be burnt, the Gra stuck out his head from his window, and he said, you should run. Meaning people didn't know what he was referring to, but later it came out that this was the Shakla V'Tarya. So that's the Ruach Ra. But that, again, I'm just giving you some extra background. But this is the tradition that the Ruach Ra got broken because of the Ger Tzedek of Vilna.
His father couldn't save him if he wanted to?
Huh?
His father couldn't save him?
Oh, his father tried to save him. His father very much wanted to save him, and his father even got a private deal because of his influence that as long as he didn't practice Judaism publicly, he could live in his father's home, he could wear tefillin, have kosher food, but publicly he shouldn't identify himself as a Jew, and the father got a deal. That's the best that the father could do. But the son said no. The son said, I am not going to pretend I'm not a Jew. Kiddush Hashem means I declare that I'm a Jew. Now, I'll tell you something. So Patatsky, Count Patatsky's, one of his estates is in a city, Landshut, a city in Poland. I think the Noam Elimelech is buried there. And the crest, these nobility have their crest, their coat of arms or whatever it is, was like a flower which had a certain number of petals equal to the children. And after his son died, one of the petals was removed. So you actually can see in Landshut, you can actually see, instead of a 5-petaled flower, it's only 4 petals, and you see one was removed. And that happened upon the death of his son. Yeah.
So kind of on the same topic of Tuma, I heard that when you go to sleep, Tuma goes down and it goes up. So the Tuma kind of stays under the bed. I heard that you're not allowed to place food under your bed, for example, because like you're saying, the Tuma could accommodate the food, and you're not allowed to use food that's was placed under your bed, for example. I just want to know the sources for that, and also if it's true that there's any way we can get rid of the Tuma.
Yeah. So indeed, it is a din in the Shulchan Aruch, based on Gemaras, that food that is under a bed should not be eaten because it absorbs the ruach ra'ah. But there are a few things to know about this. Number one, some say that this does not apply to food that is in a box or a suitcase or a bag. It only applies to uncovered food, right? So you could be makel if it's in a covered receptacle, right? So that's number one. Number two, some say if the food is solid, like an apple or whatever, you can actually do negelwasser on the apple. You pour water 3 times on the apple, and that takes away the ruach ra. Number 3, you have Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's point that the ruach ra no longer kicks in because of the Ger Tzedek, and therefore you don't have to worry about it. Number 4, now this is interesting, this is very different. Some say that the issue of food under the bed is not because of the ruach ra of your hands. It's only if this is the bed in which one had tashmish hamita with their wife, meaning a marital bed of intercourse, and bichlal it doesn't apply to a stam bed. So there are a lot of different things, but I think for most of us, the most common heter is that if it is in a container, there is no transference of the ruach ra to the food.
Is there any way to rid the Tuma in general that's under the bed, or that's just a given?
Well, it's given. It's there. You can't necessarily take a hose and do it, but it's not going to bother you, so to speak. It's kind of there, but it won't affect you if you follow the halachas. Yeah.
How does the Ohr Hachaim understand Yehudah's implication that throwing Yosef into the pit is still murder? I mentioned this question a few days.
Just 1 second. Just to remind people, the Ohr Hachaim HaKadosh has a very interesting analysis about Ruvain. Right? Ruvain argues with his brothers, let us throw him into the pit instead of killing him. And the Ohr Hachaim says, what sense does that make? If the pit was filled with snakes and scorpions, then he's going to die anyway. Right? So what is Ruvain gaining by throwing Yosef into the pit rather than killing him directly? So the Ohr Hachaim explains the following, that the brothers really maintain that Yosef deserved to die because he is alienating them from Yaakov, and they see a replication that Avram had a Yishmael that was excluded, and Yitzchak has an Esav that's excluded, and Yosef is doing the same thing to his brothers with Lashon Hara to Yaakov, that they're going to be excluded. And that's not only a temporary exclusion, but that will apply to their entire destiny to the end of time. And therefore they treated Yosef as a rodef who was destroying their life, and therefore they were going to kill him. Ruvain's argument is, hey, maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong. And just because you kill him, that doesn't mean God approved of your actions, because since you have Bechira, we could do something bad, even if it's not God's will. But if we throw him into the pit, the snake does not have Bechira. So a snake can kill you only if it's God's will. So he says, we should not be the ones who kill him. We should throw him to the snakes. If the snakes kill him, that shows he's guilty. If the snakes don't kill him, that shows that he's innocent. What's amazing is the whole thing doesn't make a lot of sense. The snakes didn't kill him, and they still sell him into slavery. Okay, that's a good question, but at least that's what Reuven was proposing. Reuven was saying, let the snakes decide, because since the snakes are not Balei Bechira, anything they do is the Ratzon of Hashem. Right? That was Reuven's argument, and this is a famous, controversial Ohr Hachaim, because the Ohr Hachaim is suggesting that if I'm a Baal Bechira, I could hurt you even keneged the will of Hashem, because I'm a Baal Bechira. Now, so that's what the Ohr Hachaim, the Ohr Hachaim is explaining Reuven's position. But now, if you go further to Yehudah's position, right? Now Reuven was planning, I guess Reuven was confident Yosef wouldn't be killed, apparently, and his plan was, I'm going to retrieve him later. Right? That was Reuven's secret plan. But Yehudah doesn't know that, and Yehudah says, what do we gain by killing our brother, and therefore let's just sell him into slavery? So the question would be, why did Yehudah think we would be killing our brother? I mean, mimanivshach. If the idea is that the snakes will kill him only if he's guilty, then if the snakes kill him, it's God's will. And if Yehudah sees the snakes aren't killing him, then that ought to tell him that he's not going to die in that pit. Right? So the question would be, what does Yehudah mean to suggest that Yosef staying in the pit would be an act of murder? Right? Ma betza. What do we gain by killing our brother? I don't think, if I recall, I don't think the Ohr Hachaim actually gives a hemshech to be masber this, and I don't even remember what I told you, but I'm thinking about it out loud, and that is the following. It could very well be that what happened here is Yosef is thrown into the pit, the snakes didn't kill him. So one would have thought that that would have convinced Yehudah that Yosef is innocent. But apparently, it didn't convince him. He said, the test is wrong. This is how strong the Yetzer Hara is. So what might have happened is that Yehudah's suggesting that the brothers are going to take him out and kill him, which was their original plan before they threw him into the pit. And on that, Yehudah's arguing, well, let's not kill him. Let's sell him into slavery, because that's the law of Rodef. You don't kill a Rodef if you can disable the threat another way. In other words, in a sense, Yehudah and Reuven might be working almost on the same wavelength, although not quite. And that is, Reuven is making the argument not to kill him, and Yehudah is making the argument not to kill him. Meaning, you see how strong the Yetzer Hara is. I mean, this was a test. If the snakes get him, he's guilty. If the snakes don't get him, he's innocent. The snakes didn't get him. So instead of saying he's innocent, there must be something wrong in the experiment. Maybe these are the wrong types of snakes. Maybe these are gentle scorpions. So let's go back to plan A and just kill him. And on that, Yehudah is addressing, ma betza and the like. Okay? Yeah.
Rashi writes that when Yitzchak knew the whole time about Yosef, but he didn't tell Yaakov because the brothers made a truce with Hashem also, that no one should say, you said that Baruch doesn't want to tell Yaakov, then why should I? What does that mean, make like a pact with Hashem? What does the brothers mean?
Well, again, like Chazal say, there was a gezerah that Yaakov and Yosef would be separated for 22 years because of the 22 years that Yaakov was not Machabed Yitzchak, his father. So essentially, this separation was a gezerah on Yaakov. So that's the notion of the brothers made a pact, meaning to say, the brothers said, we know we're doing an Aveira, but we also know that this is your gezerah, Hashem. And Hashem was maskim, not that Hashem was maskim necessarily to what the brothers Lamaisa did, but he was maskim that Yaakov should not be aware of this. In other words, that's nichlal in the onesh for kibbud aviyim. But and in that way, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is bound not to be megala. bound in the sense that this is his gezerah, that has to be carried out in that way. Yeah.
Is there a card to the concept of daas Torah outside of halachic matters? And if yes, when does it and doesn't it apply?
Yeah, this is a hard question. Is there a makor, is there a source for what is called daas Torah in what's called non-halachic matters? Let me just explain the term. Maybe not everybody is familiar with it. Daas Torah, in fact, this is maybe one of the major differences. People ask, what is the difference between modern Orthodoxy and whatever the other name is, Haredi or Yeshivish, whatever you're going to call it? And there are differences, secular education and the like, but one difference is the concept of daas Torah. Now again, not every modern Orthodox would agree with this, but many would. There is a perception, okay, I won't even use labels about modern Orthodoxy, but some Jews, many Jews who keep halacha, they look at the rabbi as the equivalent of a plumber. A plumber has a certain expertise. A plumber knows how to unclog sinks and to fix toilets. So rabbis have knowledge too. Rabbis know halacha. So they'll go to a rabbi for halacha. What happens if my fleshik spoon is in my sink or whatever it is? And they'll listen to the rabbi. Hopefully, not always that either, but hopefully listen to the rabbi, because rabbis are plumbers, and I listen to my plumber about how to fix a sink. I listen to my rabbi about kashrus. But when it comes to elections, when it comes to matters like what type of school we should make, things that are not clearly in the Shulchan Aruch, they're not yes or no answers. They're what you might call policy issues. Like, how should we set up the Jewish community and the like? They say, hey, the rabbi's opinion is no better than my opinion. I have an opinion, he has an opinion. And therefore, the fact that Rav Chaim Kanievsky said something doesn't mean anything, because I disagree with Rav Chaim Kanievsky. Now, there are many Jews that actually have that attitude. Maybe they won't say it in that way, but they say, if it's not halacha, then why is he better than me? Just like, you have now some actor or comedian expresses an opinion on global warming. Like, why should I pay that attention in particular? Now, daas Torah is a very different idea. Daas Torah was an idea that said that those who devote their lives, now it doesn't mean every rabbi, I'm not saying every rabbi, but those who devote their lives with devotion to avodas Hashem and limud HaTorah have an insight and a judgment that is greater and deeper than people who don't have that connection to Hashem. So even if Rav Chaim Kanievsky spends his whole day with Bavli, Yerushalmi, and Rambam, and it does not think about politics or peace treaties or whatever it is, his view will have a certain clarity because it'll be connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu by virtue of his Torah and Avodah. So this is the somewhat controversial idea of daas Torah, that Gedolei Yisrael, of course, who is a gadol, that'll sometimes be a question too, but Gedolei Yisrael are not only people who are, express daas on halachos, but they express daas on the hashkafa of life, even on political matters, even on social issues, because they're connected to Hashem. And when you're connected to Hashem, you see the emes in the world more than people who are not connected to Hashem. And that is a big yesod in the yeshiva, Haredi, even Hasidic world as well, although there'll be disagreements. Who is the gadol that qualifies for this? It's not everybody. In the States, we just had the Yehudah convention over Thanksgiving. They always have it over Thanksgiving. And Yehudah, like it or hate it for various reasons, Yehudah is the bastion organizationally of daas Torah. Like every single speech will be about daas Torah, daas Torah, daas Torah, daas Torah. And then you get into very interesting issues. What if daas Torah has a machlekes? There was a big demonstration in Washington 2 weeks ago. 300,000 people came, rally for Israel, support for Israel. And the Moetzes Gedolei HaTorah, the Gedolim of Agudas Yisrael, five of them said you should not go to the demonstration. The others privately, they didn't make a public, said it's okay to go to the demonstration. So the question becomes, what is das Torah at that point? Right? So someone said, das Torah doesn't mean you have to follow a particular gadol. You could follow your Rebbe or whatever it is, but it has to be somebody who comes from a Toradic perspective. So the question is, what is the makor, right? What is the source, or is there a source of the notion of das Torah? The truth is, it depends what you mean by a source. Meaning, if you're going to ask me, can I point to a chazal that says you should listen to a great Talmud Chacham, even if it's not a matter of halacha, I don't think I can point you to a line. But if you look at Perek Vav of Pirkei Avos, that talks about Kol ha'isek b'Torah lishma, that when you learn Torah lishma, you're zeicha to tremendous things. And go through the list. You're zeicha to the clarity of vision. You're zeicha to understanding. You're zeicha to chachma. You're zeicha to mayanais, like well springs coming up. So I think you can really describe das Torah by looking at the Mishnah of what does a person gain when he learns Torah lishma, right? So I think that would be your raya. Now, where das Torah became a very active force in Jewish life is really in the years before the Holocaust. In Europe, Rabbi Chanan Wasserman was a great spokesperson for the musag that every aspect of Klal Yisrael should be Moser to Gedolei Torah, and only they can give you guidance and hadracha. And this was the founding principle of Agudas Yisrael that was founded in the early 20th century. That officially, it's not always going to be the case, but officially, every single decision of Agudas Yisrael has to be approved by their what is called the Moetzes, the Council of Gedolei Torah. Of course, I don't want to get into politics. How do you get on the Moetzes? Does the Moetzes have all the Gadol? Whatever. Okay, that's a separate issue of who the Gadol is and how you choose a Gadol. But nevertheless, Agudas Yisrael's foundation was that every aspect of Klal Yisrael needs to be decided by the deya of people who are steeped in Torah and mitzvahs and avodas Hashem and Torah. Yeah.
A common theme I'm seeing now is that a lot of the terrorists who are coming and attacking the Jews now were at some point held in prison or held in captivity. Not captivity, they were held in prison by the Israeli police forces after doing different crimes. And a lot of them were even medically treated for very severe illnesses. Like I just read that Sinwar had a brain tumor, and he was treated by hospitals in Israel for what he did. So besides for political pressure, I guess, to do it, is there a halachic basis to treat somebody who you know or don't know for sure, but at least is very likely to continue?
So here is the thing. The issue of giving medical treatment to terrorists is a controversial issue. Sometimes you're giving treatment to a terrorist, and you're not treating a Jewish patient who comes in. I heard the following b'shem Rav Chaim Kanevsky. I don't know if it's true, and I have doubts that it's true. But this is what somebody reported. A member of Hatzalah said, he asked Rav Chaim Kanevsky, if you have two patients who come to you at the same time, one is a terrorist and one is a Jew, who do you treat first? Who do you go to first? That was the question. Who do you go to first? You go to the terrorist, you go to the Jew. So Rav Chaim Kanevsky said, it's a davar pashut. You go to the terrorist first, shoot him dead, and then you go to the Jew. Now, if Rav Chaim Kanevsky meant, and again, first of all, I didn't hear it from Rav Chaim Kanevsky, I heard it from this guy, so I don't even know if his report is accurate. Number two, maybe Rav Chaim Kanevsky was making a joke. He made jokes sometimes. But if it's serious, if he is saying you can kill a terrorist who comes to you for medical treatment, I think halachically that's a very, very difficult proposition, because here's the thing. The heter and the mitzvah to kill a terrorist is under the laws of Rodef. Since the terrorist is trying to kill me or another Jew, I can kill him. It's a mitzvah to kill him. Once a terrorist is arrested, once he's immobilized, once he is no longer posing an active threat, he's no longer a Rodef. If he's no longer a Rodef, what's your heter to kill him? See, remember, the heter of killing a Rodef is not because he's a bad guy, and it's not a punishment for what he did. It's a preventative measure, so he's not going to inflict future harm. To punish him for what he did, you would have to have a beis din or a court. Now, there's a vigilante can't just kill a guy for what he did. So I think it's very, very schwer to say there's a heter to directly kill a terrorist that's in custody. Now, if the pshat would be the guy's going to go home, I can't imagine the circumstances, then indeed, you can kill him because they're certainly not treat him and the like. Now, Sinwar at the time, now this is where prisoner exchanges get complicated. Sinwar at the time was serving a life sentence.
4.
Yeah, right, 4 life sentences. So Sinwar at the time was posing no danger to us. As a result, we couldn't kill him. And according to some, there would even be an inyan to give him medical treatment once he's not a sakana. Problem is that Israel has prisoner exchanges or hostage exchanges. Sinwar was one of those who were released as part of the 1,000-to-1 Gilad Shalit release. And a few years later, Sinwar, who had life-saving surgery in an Israeli hospital by a Jewish doctor, was one of the masterminds of the October 7 massacre. So the halachic question would be this: to what degree are we mechuyev to anticipate that as a possibility? Meaning like this: if we knew that he's going to remain in Israeli prison his whole life, we knew that he's never going to get out, then I think we would give him medical treatment. But the question is, we know Israel does these traits, so any given guy might get out. As a result, he may still have the status of Rodef. Now, that's a surprising conclusion. That would lead to the conclusion that not only shouldn't you give him medical treatment, but Rav Chaim Kanievsky, you could kill him on the spot right now because he still has the status of Rodef. So it's an interesting question. The question is, to what degree are we mechuyev to take these exchanges into account?
And also, like the prison, for example, it costs the country money to maintain these prisons. Are we mechuyev, to invest money?
So I'm going to say something again that's not politically correct. Me'ikar hadin, we're not mechuyev to give medical treatment to any Gentile, even a righteous Gentile. The only chiyuv of giving refuah to a Gentile is because of Ava. You don't want to cause hatred and animosity in the world. And Ava obligates us to render medical assistance. So the question becomes, but terrorists who hate you no matter what, the Ava is there if you treat them, and the Ava is there if you don't treat them. So it could very well be there's no chiyuv to give them medical assistance. On the other hand, Ava could be a broader concept. Ava doesn't mean this guy's going to hate me. It may mean that the United States will cut off aid to Israel. Ava could be a very broad thing. So even though the guy is a terrorist, thank you. Even though the guy is a terrorist, but the international community may hate Israel, and therefore we still should give them medical treatment unless we're aiding and abetting a rodef. That's the issue, and that's the issue of, are we mechuyev to factor in the possibility of prisoner exchanges? I believe, this gets into an interesting issue. Is Israel bound halachically by the conventions, the Geneva Conventions for prisoners of war and everything else? I do believe, I don't want to say for sure, that number one, it is a war crime under international law to kill a POW, a prisoner of war in custody. And I believe it's also a war crime, or at least it's an offense, not to give medical treatment to people that you've captured. Now, that's international law, that's not halacha. But one question might be that for a Jewish state to violate international law, that might be Ava, that itself causes Ava, because we're going against the haskama of the umos as to how to treat. And then you also have to worry, Ava too, about retaliation, meaning that's also Ava, meaning you treat them a certain way. I mean, they treat Jews awful the way it is, but they're going to, even do worse, to that. So all of that cheshbon's in Ava. So the chiyuv is ultimately Ava. It's not a chiyuv d'oraisa of refuah, but it's a chiyuv of Ava. Yeah.
Is there any real isser for a Jewish state to run off of non-halachic guidelines?
I'm going to say again, is there an isser for what?
For a Jewish state, for example, Israel, to run off of Medina that's not non-halachically.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the whole question. I mean, in other words, this is a non-halachic state, and you're asking, is it usher to live here, or is it usher to make a non-halachic state?
Yeah.
Well, presumably, it is usher to make a non-halachic state, because if the Torah says that laws are supposed to be X, Y, and Z, so to create a system where the laws are not X, Y, and Z is a violation of halacha. But I would agree with you that it is mutter for us to create a state where individuals are not punished for violating halacha. In other words, a state that maintains freedom of religion. In other words, Israel is what's called a Jewish democracy, right? So any individual has the legal right to be Jewish, to be Christian, to be atheist, to be secular. Now, let's ask that specific question. If I'm a religious Jew, would I be allowed to be part of a state that does not require Jews to practice Judaism? So here, there is a halachic argument in favor of it, and that is, when we don't have a Beis HaMikdash and we don't have a Sanhedrin, we actually don't have coercive power to punish people for Shabbos or for kashrus and the like. And the idea here is that we communicate Yiddishkeit by education, by persuasion, by example, and not by coercion. So it depends what you mean by a non-halachic state. If you mean by a non-halachic state that religion is not coerced, that is actually a good idea in this day and age. Because if you were to pass a law, let's imagine we pass like the Taliban passes laws like that. We would pass a law, let's assume we would say, anyone who desecrates Shabbos gets publicly stoned. I mean, what would happen? What would happen is there would be armed revolution. Meaning, in a time of Hester Panim, before Mashiach, you can't convey Torah by coercion. You have to convey Torah in a sweet way of persuasion. So in that sense, we could have a non-halachic state. But if you're talking about a state which in itself is doing things against halacha, that's a very different thing. So it depends on issue by issue by issue. You'd have to identify it. You know, the first chief rabbi of the state of Israel, not Rav Kook. Rav Kook died before there was a state of Israel. But the first chief rabbi was the grandfather of the president of Israel, same name, Rav Yitzchak Herzog. And Rav Yitzchak Herzog was an enormous Talmid Chacham. He was kind of Rabbi Yosef's mentor, not Rebbe necessarily, but mentor. He guided Rabbi Yosef. He made Rabbi Yosef a dayan so many years ago. And Rav Herzog was brilliant. He was chief rabbi of Ireland, of all places. And he didn't go to yeshiva, but he was a Baki in Bavli Yerushalmi and everything. And Rav Herzog wanted to do something, a very ambitious plan. He wanted to kind of have svarim that show how do you run a modern state in accordance with halacha. Meaning, how do you have a police department in accordance with halacha, an army, a fire department, national security apparatus? I mean, there are a lot of things that have to be in operation 24/7. So what is it? Do you rely on goyim? Is that Hashem's kavanah? In other words, what does HaKadosh Baruch Hu want us to do in running a modern country in accordance with halacha? In truth, there are very few makaris on this, because for most of our history, we weren't in that situation. So most halacha focuses on individual rules. What do I do? You know, how do I keep Shabbos? But it doesn't focus on things on the governmental level. So Rav Herzog wanted Svarim to be written, Talmidei Chachamim, to work on how do you create a kosher fire department, a kosher police department, a kosher national security thing. What is pikuach nefesh, what is not pikuach nefesh, right? Is working on Shabbos for national security called pikuach nefesh. And it didn't get that far. One Rav Eliezer Waldenberg did write 3 volumes called Hilchas Medina, which explores a lot of these questions, not all of them. But once again, now it's dated already because it goes back to the 1950s. Technology changes. So the issue you're raising is an important issue. It's an issue that people think about, but we don't have a lot of halachic writing on it. Surprisingly little halachic writing, because for Dorei Doros, halacha was focusing on yechidim. It was not focusing on governmental institutions. Yeah.
I just wanted to have a little clarity on the whole incident with Yehudah and Tamar.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I know that I saw some of the way they explain it is how Yehudah was trying to say these social kedushah that were embedded, in doing such an act. And there's some suggestion that even focus on how Yehudah was almost coerced and had to fear to do this act. I want to understand the motive and exactly where, on a simplistic level, I guess, where he messed up, and B was that is this also in very stark contrast what would be nowadays. If a Torah leader, that would do anything similar to this, but especially in Jewish tradition and
Yeah.
also, we still value Yehudah as being one of our greatest leaders. So
Listen, times were different. What can I tell you? It's absolutely true. If you learn Tanakh, it is a different world. Yeah, the halachos are the same, even though it's before Matan Torah. But, things weren't cut and dried, black and white, yeshivish, levush, streimels. Things didn't work that way. David HaMelech, was not, didn't look like the Brisker Rav or whatever it is. So you do have to understand that, biblical life was not the same as modern Orthodox Haredi or Yeshivish life. It was a different tekufa. Things were different then, at least in terms of certain aspects of the Chitzonius. But according to the Zohar says an amazing thing. Just as we, the expression in English, a wolf in sheep's clothing. That means it's a wolf, but it dresses up like a sheep. The Zohar says, it doesn't use this word, there is such a thing as a sheep in wolf's clothing. The Zohar HaKadosh says that sometimes very powerful ideas of kedushah can only enter the world in the guise, in the levush of what looks like averos and impropriety. Why? Because there are kochos of tumah, which are weapons that seek out kedushah and try to destroy it. And don't let the kedushah come in. So the kedushah has to be duped. The sitra achra, the kochos of tumah, have to be fooled. They have to be duped. Something looks like an avera, so it lets it in. But that's only the outer levush. And then the kernel of holiness comes in. And the Zohar stresses that this is the whole shalshelis of Mashiach. Mashiach, which brings redemption to the world. It brings the light of God into the world. Mitchila v'ad seif is encased, is obscured in a klipa, in a shell of things that look improper. Let's go back to Lot and his daughters. Ammon in Moab. Rus comes from Moab. David comes from Moab. Mashiach therefore comes from Moab. And even Ammon has a role, because one of Shlomo HaMelech's wives was Naamah HaAmmonis, and Mashiach comes from Naamah. So Ammon and Moab are both the ancestors of Mashiach. And then you have Yehudah is mezana with what he thinks is a prostitute, which is Tamar. And then you have the story of Rus coming to Boaz in the middle of the night. A very shocking thing. And then you have David HaMelech himself with David and Bathsheba, because remember, David and Shlomo HaMelech was born from David and Bathsheba. So all of this, the Gemara in Yuma puts it a different way. The Gemara in Yuma says, a person cannot be nichnas l'malchus unless there's a kupa shel shiratzim. That means a bag of rodents behind you. We would call it skeletons in your closet. The Gemara doesn't say why, but the pashtus of the Gemara is that keeps a person humble and modest because he has all of these black marks in his past. But the Zohar says that is part of the mystery of how kedushah comes into the world in a levush of Tumah. And Rav Kook extended this Zohar, here we're getting into controversy, to modern Zionism as well. Because people always say, how could there be a spiritual value in building up Eretz Yisrael? How can you say that this is the footsteps of Mashiach? How can you say it's the beginning of Geula? Whatever lashon you're going to use. Look at the people who were the pioneers of Zionism, people who not only weren't keeping Torah in many cases, but antagonistic to Torah. How could there be any spiritual chashivas in that which is done by Machalulei Shabbos Befarhesia? Rav Kook's answer would be, this is just continuing the old pattern of Ammon and Moab and Rus and Boaz and Yehudah and Tamar, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu brings kedushah into the world in the guise of Tumah. In fact, Rav Kook dealt with a lot of things, even feminism, which was a very, very beginning idea in his time, not what it became later. He made the point, it's a very thought-provoking point, that the sheirish of a lot of these things is actually a very good idea. The idea that women are entitled to dignity, they shouldn't be put down, they shouldn't be oppressed, they shouldn't be humiliated, their contribution should be valued. That's good. That's emes. So then it gets into the world, though, in a levush of all sorts of crazy things, whether it's lesbianism or whatever the issue would be. And then it becomes makulkal. Then it gets ruined. But in its sheirish, there's a lot of goodness. A lot of goodness. There was a rabbi in London who got into deep, 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 deep trouble over this. Maybe I shouldn't go where he went. He gave a speech on gay rights. An Orthodox rabbi. And he got in awful trouble because he seemed to be legitimating it and saying it was good. But I'm going to explain what he really meant. And maybe he won't agree with me, but I'm going to explain what he meant. And he didn't say it right, and he said it in a way that he got in big, big trouble. In fact, he wasn't fired. He was almost fired. He wasn't fired, but I think he has to, every share he gives, like he has to give it to a higher rabbi to look at it. It's really kind of embarrassing. Everything has to be read by somebody else. He was saying the following. He was saying, again, I don't want to get hate mail over this, that men have difficulty forming friendships and showing emotion. So he was saying gay relationships showed men that they can have friendships, they can have deep emotions. Now, you can understand why that sounds very outrageous from a halachic standpoint. What are you saying? But I'll tell you what he's saying. He's really saying Rav Kook's idea. And that is, in the tumah, there is a kernel. But the problem is, the kernel gets distorted. And then it becomes very, very bad. But there's still a kernel. Men can have friendships. Men can love each other in kosher ways. And that is what you can extract even from tumah. Okay? But this is so dangerous. Because when you endorse tumah, you then become meshukah. You become enmeshed in tumah. That's the danger of Zionism. That's the danger of feminism. That's the danger of gay rights. Right? You see what's going on here. It's all the same idea. And that is, in every sheker, Chazal say it already, Chazal say beferish, in every sheker, there's a kernel of emes. Problem is, how do I know I'm picking the right kernel, right? There's a kernel of emes. I might pick the kernel of sheker, That's very, very hard. But Rav Kook said that but the Metzias is Azam Metzias. And that's Yehudah and Tamar, that's Zionism, that's feminism, that's all these different inyanim. Yeah.
There are several of the apocrypha around the time of the Bai Sheni that Chazal excluded from Tanakh. Some of these frum seem to be heretical, others seem to be truthful, others somewhere in between. When they come across controversial works like the Book of Enoch or the Book of Jubilees, do we think these books have any kedushah to them?
Yeah, so we talked a little about it this morning. The books of the apocrypha, which Chazal call Svarim Chitzonim. On one hand, Chazal have an extremely negative view of them. They say anyone who reads Svarim Chitzonim doesn't have a share in Olam Haba. On the other hand, Chazal themselves quote the book of Ben Sira. Ben Sira is very similar to Proverbs, to Mishlei, and Chazal quote Ben Sira. So they used it. Rishonim quote, as I said, the book of the Maccabees and the like, Rashi and the like. So the answer is that when Chazal condemned the Svarim Chitzonim, they were not condemning everything that's in the Apocrypha. The works of history are fine, but the works of religious thought, like Sefer of Enosh and Sefer Hayovelos in particular, have things that are, connected either to Christianity or to paganism, Avodah Zarah, and therefore Chazal said it's better to avoid it. Now, if you're asking me, do the works have kedushah? So the answer is the works that are heretical have no kedushah, and the works that are not heretical don't have the kedushah of Kisvei HaKodesh, but they might have the kedushah of a Musar book. Let's take a book like Ben Sira. So you ask me a question, does Ben Sira have kedushah? Well, I could ask you, does Orchos Tzadikim have kedushah? It's a book about midos and a book about living your life, and Chazal considered it to have useful information. So kedushah itself is a multifaceted idea. It doesn't have the kedushah of prophetic and Ruach HaKodesh works, but it has the kedushah of a work that's giving you a hashkafa as to how you live your life. So on some level it does have kedushah, but the questionable books do not have kedushah at all. It's the same kedushah as the New Testament in effect. Yeah.
What's the approach on sheberach tzahal? Is it like adding something like to
Yeah. What's the approach? I mean, what's my approach? What's the approach? I don't know the approach. Listen. I don't want to get into controversy, although maybe I'm too late for that already. The thing is, in the yeshiva world, as you know, I can't say I know every single yeshiva. Outside of Dati Leumi, outside of Hester, we don't recite the sheberach for the tzahal. There is a big question, why not? Why not? Even if you don't say the prayer for the state of Israel, okay? Because you don't believe it's Reishis, Semichas Gulaseinu, you don't believe it's the beginning of Mashiach. But the Chayalim, we say Tehillim for the Chayalim, so we are praying, that they should be okay. So what's wrong with a prayer for the tzahal? Why not say a prayer for the tzahal? What's the argument against it? So they asked Rav Asher Weiss about what the argument was, and he came up with something, but I don't know, it's schwach to me. He said, we don't like to add things to davening. But we do add plenty of stuff. We say sheberachs for every person who gets an aliyah to the Torah. We say a sheberach for a yoledes. We say a sheberach for a child. So why not say a sheberach for the tzahal? So I would think, if I would be writing the rules, which I don't, I would think that every kehillah should say a sheberach for the tzahal. It's absolutely proper to do so. But my feeling is that the people who don't want to do it they feel that the tzahal is so much connected to the state that in effect you would be legitimating the state and everything it does by praying explicitly for an organ of the state that does national defense. So it's therefore linked indirectly with Zionism. I would argue it shouldn't be linked with Zionism. It shouldn't be totally on Zionism. But I think in people's perception, it's makusher to tzionit, and therefore you can't. You should.
Like part of does it do the same thing? Like does it include chaylik tzahal?
Well, it does. In other words, I think that's the point. We will pray for the tzahal as part of our prayers for everybody. So when I say achenu, I'm not just thinking about the tzahal, I'm also thinking about the hostages, and I'm thinking about people here in Yerushalayim who might be under attack, God forbid. In other words, it's klaliistic. So if it's klaliistic, you don't have the Zionist endorsement. But to single out the tzahal, some are afraid it's too connected to the Zionist state. Again, my own shita, my own shita doesn't count, but my own shita is that I don't think it should be connected that way, but I'm explaining to people who don't want to do it. Yeah.
Earlier you made the point that in a pre-Mashiach time, we can't coerce Torah. Is the implication of that once Mashiach comes, we can coerce?
Well, here's the thing. Once Mashiach comes, we will have the power to coerce people, but there may be no need to because Mashiach will bring people to tshuva. But all I'm saying is, when Mashiach comes, all of the halachic institutions get restored. That includes Malkus and Misa. Now, will they have to be administered? Could very well be not. But the institutional structure will be there to allow ownership. I mean, at the time of the Beis HaMikdash, there was a punishment system. Violating halacha was a crime. It was the law of the land that you have to keep. If you're a Jew, you have to keep halacha. Of course, you have to be warned. There are technicalities regarding that. Okay, yeah.
It's a bigger question, so maybe I should leave for next time.
Okay, yeah, this is the last question, yeah.
We have in Psak Halacha 2 different ways to have paskin similarly. Like in the Gemara, we find many times, like we always go after the later Psak, Basrei, and Shani we find it all the time. Like remember, we always say Kisa, everybody before him, and they say even by the Vilna Gaon, Kisa the Magen Avram. But at the same time, we also have the exact opposite, where like the Shulchan Aruch always passes like the Rambam, Neshar Gadol, and we always like Mitzadach, we always have the Basar, but Mitzad Hashem, we always have also like the bigger ones. Like what is it?
Yeah. So the question is that in the klolim of Psak Halacha, we often have opposite rules, and that's very, very true. We say, oh, you paskin like the later generations because they saw the earlier arguments and they came to their conclusion. That's halacha kebasrai. And then you have opposites that, we go back to the greater gedolim of the past, and they are the makor that we're going to follow. It is a contradiction because sometimes they use one rule, sometimes they use another rule. But there's a third rule that is machriya all rules, and that may be the answer. This is Yavai HaKasav, Shnei Ksivim Makrishin Zeh. 2 rules contradict each other. Yavai HaKasav Hashlishi. And the Kasav Hashlishi is also a very important yesod from the Vilna Gaon, although it's implicit in much earlier than the Vilna Gaon. And that is, if you're a yachid who has reached the level of Higia L'Hara, where you're capable of paskening directly from the sugyas, you can follow whatever seems more logical to you. And therefore, the pshat is like this. If Rav Yosef Karo follows the Rambam, it isn't the pshat he blindly follows the Rambam, but he was machriya that the Rambam is more emes here. And that overrides halacha kibasroi, because all of those rules are for a person, let's say most of us. We're not higia l'hayra, so I have to know, how do I paskin? So I have rules that tell me how to paskin. But says the Gra, a yachid shehigia l'hayra is not bound by any klal of psak, and he simply machriya what he considers to be the emes. In fact, the Gra said beferish that there's no chiyuv on such a person to even follow the Shulchan Aruch b'chlal. Now, he can't be chaylik on a Tana, whatever it is, he's not going that far, but l'chol hapos, anything after the Gemara, the yachid shehigia l'hayra can come to his own maskana. They even say in modern times, I was pretty surprised, Rav Yisroel Zalman, who was not, the Gra, Rav Yisroel Zalman was much, much later, would paskin in his private life like the Rambam. For an Ashkenazi, that's very unusual. He said, because he spent his life writing on the Rambam, Even Oazel. He says the Rambam was his Rebbe. He says he followed the Rambam. That's what he said. Yeah.
On this, I saw that Rabbi writes that the Psak of Eretz Yisrael before was that everyone paskin like
the Mechaber.
Because he was
the Mora Diasra of Eretz Yisrael. Yeah, this is very famous. Rav Ovadia took the position that Ashkenazim have no right to exist. You can exist physically. He wasn't saying kill Ashkenazim, but he said, you come to Eretz Yisrael, says every Ashkenazi who was, because originally Sephardim with a rov, every Ashkenazi, kama batel, was mechuyev to be batel to the minhagim of Sfarad that were makabel in Eretz Yisrael, the shita of the mechaber, and even when Ashkenazim become the rov, they've already become batel to the Sephardim. So he said he doesn't have the kayach to enforce that, but he said there should not have been a separate Ashkenazi kehila in Eretz Yisrael bichlal. But it could be the teretz is the gra l'shitasei, that the basis of the minhagim of Ashkenaz were the Talmidei Hagra, and the gra holds if they're Hagiel l'hayra, they could be machriya keneged everything. They weren't mechuyev to go with the mora diasra or anything else. So it's an interesting question. What gives a kehila? In fact, but it's interesting. The gra tained that on Hasidim. It's interesting that what Rav Ovadia is taining on Talmidei Hagra, the gra tained on Hasidim. What gave them the right to break away and create kehilas of new minhagim? But maybe because the gra held they were not higil l'hayra, so they were, which also goes l'shitase in terms of his view of Hasidim. But that's a fascinating question. Like, when can you kind of, do your own thing? Even as part of a kehila, when can you establish a new Eidah, so to speak? Okay, thank you, and have a Freilich Hanukkah, and we'll see you.